Good afternoon. We're going to resume with portfolio questions, government business and constitutional relations. Our first question from Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what plans it has for a new constitutional convention.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll be inviting members to participate in a new constitutional convention which will aim to secure a consensus across Scottish society on Scotland's right to choose. I will consult with party leaders in the Parliament on the detail of this shortly.
Patrick Harvey.
It's often struck me as a little odd that those most hostile to independence quite often are those least likely to put forward a coherent alternative, another way of improving Scotland's constitutional status and governance instead of independence. So if they are willing to take this one last opportunity to try and put something positive onto the table, I'll welcome it. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that this discussion, as well as dealing with the domestic constitutional questions, also should have room for discussion about how we can broaden and deepen Scotland's relationship with other countries, including across Europe, but not limited to that, the ability to forge those relationships in our own way, on our own terms?
Cabinet Secretary.
I do agree with the member, but I think the member makes a very important point. This is about openness to discussion. And particularly, and I've just said it in my opening answer, about a consensus on Scotland's right to choose. Now, there may well be different points of view on ultimate destination. Some may believe, as I hear from the benches to one side of me, that we've already reached the destination. But in those circumstances, I think openness to debate and discussion is the hallmark of a democracy. And I hope we might all... The hallmark of a democracy is not shouting while somebody else is speaking. The hallmark of a democracy is being able to have that debate, and I look forward to it.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I look forward to engaging in these exchanges with the Cabinet Secretary in a constructive tone as we go forward. And in that vein, doesn't it every week go by demonstrate this idea of a constitutional convention is just a back of a fag packet notion dreamed up to placate the pro-independence fanatics on the SNP backbenches? And can he tell me how much the taxpayer is going to have to pay to fund this vanity exercise?
Cabinet Secretary.
Murdo Fraser to his new role, and also I look forward to a continuing redefinition of the English language. The word constructive has just been redefined. No doubt there will be more. The cost to Scotland of the Brexit process in which we are engaged, into which we have been dragged, for which we did not vote, and which will do, as we know, enormous harm. And we now see the migration process, which very sensible voices, who are not mad nationalists by any manner of means, are pointing the disastrous nature of them to Scotland. All those things make me believe that the expensive option is staying with the status quo.
Hilton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite the differing views and independence across this chamber, I'm sure that we'll all agree it should be the people in Scotland to decide on our own future. In light of the cast iron mandate for another referendum from both the public and this Parliament, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that UK Government plans to block a second poll are simply unsustainable?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I note a wider and wider range of people are pointing to the unsustainable nature of the UK Government's position. I thought the book event that the former Speaker, Mr Bercow, did last night was yet another indication that people looking at this say to themselves, Mr Bercow, of course, who was a Conservative, people looking at this would say to themselves, there is a basic problem in the attitude of the UK Government, because it looks as if it does not have any interest either in democracy or the voice of the Scottish people. And I think that's a bad look in any democracy, and I hope that they will realise what a bad look it is and come back into the democratic mainstream.
And Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to have a discussion. I think that at this present time in Scotland, there is no majority demanding a second independence referendum. Now, I have made clear that the right of the Scottish people to determine their own future is absolute, and it's something that the Labour Party will support. The discussion for me is how best do we move forward, and in doing so, if we reach a position in the future where there is clearly a demand for a referendum, then that should not be denied. Is the Cabinet Secretary more open to having that wider discussion for those of us who reject the status quo, want to see far greater devolution take place, and is that on the table for discussion?
Yes, of course it is on the table for discussion. I respect Mr Rowley's position on this. I would want to debate it with him. I would want to say that I believe he's wrong in terms of the demand that exists. I would want to point to the way in which that demand is being expressed, including through elections. I would point to the fact that the clarity of the manifestos in December indicated that the election was about having Scotland's right to choose, and that was indicated very strongly. But of course, I respect Mr Rowley's position as a Democrat. He does not believe that independence is the solution at this time, and I'm glad for his openness in that continuity that might exist. That is precisely the type of thing that Scotland should be talking about. And I want to create the opportunity for Scotland to talk about that, not narrowly just amongst politicians, but more widely. So what I will bring forward is a set of proposals which starts that process. And if Mr Rowley and the Labour Party wants to and intends to contribute to that process, I would be delighted on the terms on which he has given.
Thank you. Question number 2, Jamie Green.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government if all existing commitments from government ministers, serving or otherwise, to present evidence to parliamentary committees will go ahead.
Minister Graham Day.
Presiding Officer, Ministers will of course fulfil all commitments to give evidence to parliamentary committees. Requests to former ministers to give evidence are a matter for the individuals and the committee concerned.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the Minister for that update? The Minister will be aware that the Rural Economy Committee is midway through a very important cross-party inquiry into ferry procurement. The former Cabinet Secretary for Finance was due to give important evidence on the matter due to the specific involvement in some of the questions that the inquiry has raised, not least those of a financial nature. I appreciate the Government may choose to send whoever they deem fit. It is imperative that the committee is able to complete its inquiry by taking evidence from those with direct knowledge of events. So can I ask what reassurances the Minister will give the Chamber that the Government will work with committees to ensure that those that they do send to represent the Government will do so having direct knowledge and involvement in these matters, and therefore will speak from experience rather than hearsay?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, recognition of their accountability to the committees of this Parliament is demonstrated daily by Scottish Government ministers. As the Minister for Parliamentary Business, I have clear sight of the interaction between committees and ministers, and we consider their relationship generally to be very good. All of which is in sharp contrast, incidentally, to the relationship between our committees and ministers in the UK Government. The Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, for example, recently pulled out of an appearance before the European Committee at the 11th hour with no substantial explanation offered. And famously, David Davis assured MSPs he would give evidence at Holyrood as Brexit Secretary, but failed to do so in a 2-year tenure. Presiding Officer, whilst the UK Government seems to regard the committees of this Parliament with disdain, this Scottish Government recognises entirely its responsibilities in this regard. To be clear, any commitments given to attend committees by ministers will be honoured, but former ministers do not speak for the Government. Any commitments made by former ministers pass to their successors. And that is the situation, Presiding Officer.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Minister share my incredulity at the Tories' complete lack of self-awareness, such as their dog-like devotion to the London bosses? They have failed to notice the number of times UK ministers cancelled scheduled appearances at this Parliament's committee, often at short notice. Can he confirm that it is UK ministers who need to up their game, show this Parliament respect and attend our committees when invited?
Minister.
Well, absolutely. I think earlier we had a reinvention of the definition of constructive. I think the Tories can certainly reinvent the phrase self-awareness in this regard. And of course, it's not just the individuals that I highlighted, Alistair Jack and David Davis. There have been a raft of others. I think Esther McVeigh also qualifies in that category. So absolutely, it is high time that the UK Government and its ministers showed the committees of this Parliament the respect they deserve.
Question number 3, Rachel Hamilton.
To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of potential customs checks on the Scotland-England border in light of comments by the First Minister during an address to the European Policy Centre.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government is committed to putting all the information on a proposition for an independent Scotland into the public domain ahead of an independence referendum. It is important to note that the Scottish Government does not wish to erect borders. It is the UK Government that wishes to erect borders by pursuing a hard Brexit. That is precisely what Boris Johnson is now doing.
Rachel Hamilton.
Constituents of mine in border towns such as Coldstream, Eyemouth and Jedburgh are deeply concerned by the First Minister's comments made in Brussels, where she failed to rule out a hard border in the event that Scotland became an independent country. Figures show that exports to the rest of the UK are worth £51.2 billion, 3 times more than exports worth £16.1 million to Scotland. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he will acknowledge the significant importance of the single market and ask why the Scottish Government would want to place a barrier between friends, families and neighbours in my constituency, crippling borders communities and inflicting customs checks on Scottish goods?
Cabinet Secretary.
The issue of self-awareness has just been redefined once again this afternoon. The member used the words single market. Apparently, Rachel Hamilton is in favour of the single market, which must be news to Boris Johnson. Let me be very clear about this. We do not wish, I am trying to make a point, Presiding Officer, we do not wish to erect any borders. The simplest way to have no borders would be and would continue to be the continued presence of all parts of these islands in the single market and the customs union. That is on offer. Anything that the UK government does to jeopardise that is the UK government's responsibility. If constituents of Rachel Hamilton's are worried, they should be expressing that worry to her, to the Conservatives and to Boris Johnson. Their friend in having no borders is me and the SNP.
Claire Adamson.
Presiding Officer, back in the real world, the UK Government has indicated that goods coming into the UK from the EU will face import controls from as early as January next year. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what engagement he has had with the UK Government over the preparations being made to prevent disruption to both businesses and consumers?
Yeah, this is a very, very broad supplementary to the question, so quite a short answer, Mr. Russell.
As ever, the UK Government has not told us what they intend in this case, because I don't think they have a clue.
Question number 4, Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it last met UK ministers to discuss post-Brexit international trade policy.
Minister Graham Day.
The Minister for International Trade and Investment, Ivan McKee, discussed a range of trade-related issues with Conor Burns, the UK Minister for International Trade, and counterparts from Wales and Northern Ireland on the 23rd of January.
Adam Tompkins.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The Minister knows that I am robustly of the view that Brexit must be and has been devolved compatibly with our devolution settlement. Yet the Minister has unilaterally demanded a whole string of vetoes for his devolved administration on international trade, which is a reserved matter. How is that respecting the devolution settlement?
Yeah. Minister.
Presiding Officer, sadly there's a world of difference between being in the room putting forward the needs of Scotland with a view to UK-wide negotiations and having these genuinely taken on board. And unlike Mr Tompkins, I speak from first-hand experience of this, having represented the government on the Joint Ministerial Forum EN, which was designed to inform a joint negotiating position which catered for the needs of all parts of these islands. I seem to recall one particular session with UK ministers where they insisted to the devolved administrations that their concerns over continuing access to Erasmus were entirely misplaced. They'd be taken care of. Well, we all know what happened subsequently. The Tories voted down proposals at Westminster, committing them to securing future Erasmus involvement. Presiding Officer, whether it be on Erasmus, migration, trade, or a raft of other important matters, there's one certainty. Either Scottish ministers fight Scotland's corner, or Scotland risks being turned over by the Tories. We'll leave Mr Tompkins to strategise a way. Our team of ministers will continue to stand up for Scotland's interest in Brexit negotiations, particularly on trade.
Question number 5, Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what engagement it has had with the UK Government in providing young people with clarity regarding whether they will continue to have access to the Erasmus Plus programme following Brexit.
I can welcome to a new portfolio, Minister Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government has been engaging extensively with the UK Government throughout the pre- and post-EU exit period, both at ministerial and official level. The Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science, Richard Lockhead, has been in regular contact to discuss Erasmus Plus with the UK Government Universities Ministers, which has included participating in all UK nations quadrilateral meetings. Scottish Government officials are engaging with the Department for Education and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport on Erasmus Plus potential domestic alternatives, while reiterating the Scottish Government's position that full association to Erasmus Plus is in the best interest for both Scotland and the whole of the UK. However, despite frequent requests by the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Michael Russell, all at the Joint Ministerial Committee meeting on EU negotiations, UK Government departments have refused to share final drafts of crucial value for money assessments with Scottish Government officials. These assessments are being used by the Treasury to make decisions that will directly impact on future participation. The Scottish Government has raised this directly with HM Treasury and will continue to do so alongside the other devolved administrations.
Sandra White.
Thank you, Minister, and congratulate and welcome to her new post for the very full reply, which is obviously very, very concerning, particularly in my constituency of Glasgow Kelvin, where we have thousands of students who have actually benefited from Erasmus, and it's very worrying for the current students and for future students going there as well, generations really to come. Now, you mentioned the fact that there's nothing forthcoming from the UK Parliament. Can I ask the Minister and the Scottish Government if they would push forward with talks, or if they've had talks with other European countries in regards, perhaps open a dialogue with our European friends to discuss how we can safeguard this very, very important Erasmus for students?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I say to Sandra White that having studied and lived in her constituency, I'm only too aware from personal experience of the huge benefit the Erasmus Plus programme brings to Glasgow Kelvin. The Scottish Government is absolutely committed to ensuring that we do everything in our gift to maintain the Erasmus Plus scheme. As part of our preparations for EU exit, we are therefore progressing work in relation to a number of different scenarios. Our preferred outcome is, of course, that the whole of the UK remains associated to Erasmus+. However, in the event that the UK Government decides to abandon the programme, we are exploring the option of Scotland's unilateral association. Work in this area is ongoing and it features a number of interconnected elements, including considerations on how to best engage with our European partners concerning this issue. It's also worth noting that the European Commission has proposed to double the funding of Erasmus for the next cycle to €30 billion. That's funding that Scotland will miss out on, but it's also knowledge transfer, it's friendships, it's relationships which the next generation will miss too. Presiding Officer, I'm sure I do not need to remind members that this is not what our constituents voted for in June 2016.
Question 6, John Finney.
To ask the Scottish Government what communication it's had with the UK Government and how it will protect Scotland's crofters in upcoming trade deal talks with the EU.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we've received no communication from the UK Government on the protection of crofting interests in upcoming trade deal discussions. The Scottish Government is committed to doing all it can to support crofting for the benefit of present and future generations. As a former crofting minister and as an MSP with crofting constituency interests, I know that crofting continues to form an integral part and contributes to the sustainability of our rural and remote areas. Crofting delivers real benefits, sustaining agricultural activity, supporting the rural economy, enhancing wildlife and the natural environment, and retaining young people in our remote, rural and island communities. It is worth standing up for, and we will stand up for it.
John Finney.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply? The Cabinet Secretary knows that Brexit's a disaster for the Highlands and Islands. He also knows of the importance of rearing sheep to crofters and of the potential tariffs of 40 to 50% being imposed on lamb. Cabinet Secretary, a survey in 2017 by the Scottish Association of Meat Wholesalers talked about the significant dependence of migrant labour. 52% of the unskilled workforce, 44% of the skilled workforce and 16% of the supervisory and management staff. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise what consultation the UK Government has had with the Scottish Government about the horrendous consequences of their hard Brexit strategy, coupled with their newly announced immigration policy, and what implications that will have for meat production in the Highlands and Islands, one of the many sectors that will be negatively impacted by the ill-judged actions of a far-right UK Tory government?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member is absolutely correct in terms of lamb and sheep production. I know from my own constituents and from my own engagement, for example, with the National Farmers Union of Scotland within Argyll, that if there were to be the tariffs talked about, that would be the end of the lamb trade for my constituents. I also know that that is the case in Wales, where there has been discussion at the JMC about lamb and the impact on Scottish and Welsh economies. The member can be reassured that we will continue to pursue these issues, but it does show very clearly that the idea that there is some form of Brexit, some one-size-fits-all form of Brexit, which in the words of not just the Prime Minister, but even Douglas Ross, who was a member of this chamber and I understand is now a Scottish Minister, that in some size these will always benefit Scotland, is untrue.
Question number 7, Sarah Boyle.
Scottish Government what steps it is taking to ensure that EU powers that related to devolved matters are devolved to the Scottish Parliament.
Cabinet Secretary.
Sarah Boyack, Presiding Officer, is right to be concerned about this matter. It's not the first occasion which she's asked about it. There is a continuing risk that the UK Government uses Brexit to claw powers back from this Parliament. We've been clear that on EU withdrawal, the EU powers over agriculture, fisheries, the environment and elsewhere should be exercised by this Parliament in line with the devolution settlement. We have tried to work with the UK Government and other devolved administrations to negotiate and agree UK-wide frameworks where that is in our interests. But these must be agreed and not imposed. We'll continue to resist any and all attempts to constrain this Parliament. I'm glad that parties across this chamber have in the past supported this position, and I do hope that will continue.
Sarah Boyack.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response? In terms of the environment, in relation to food standards and procurement, for example, will the Scottish Government continue to use EU standards as a benchmark to drive continuous improvement?
Cabinet Secretary.
I made it clear in my evidence to the Culture and European Committee this morning that we intend to take steps to ensure that we can keep pace with European regulation and European standards. Moreover, we believe that that is our absolute right as a devolved administration in the areas of devolved competence to choose how we benchmark ourselves and how we take ourselves forward. We will bring forward, as I indicated previously, a continuity bill that allows us to do so, and we will also make sure that in other areas we are insisting upon the highest standards. I should point out, Presiding Officer, this isn't arcane or technical. This is about ensuring that the common interests, common beliefs, common opportunities, and the common views that we have across Europe are sustained. We want to associate ourselves with these standards, not because we want to associate ourselves with Europe, but because they're the right things for Scotland, and we intend to do so.
Thank you very much, and that concludes portfolio questions.